So the question or the subject I was given was, are we more than our DNA? And on the face of it, that's fairly straightforward. Some people say, well, I don't know anything about genetics, so I guess we've got to set ourselves some questions at the beginning. And ask yourself, have you seen one of these in your garden recently? And I guess the answer is probably not. Looks like a sparrow with the face of a baboon, which just goes to prove that we actually start tonight with some common ground, because we all know something about genetics, we all know something about DNA, we all know something about genetic inheritance. And that's actually important. There's a lot of this information we all know. It's out there in the public domain. So what I'd like to do tonight is really to try and structure this in a way that might help, hopefully, challenge you to think. It'll let you know a little bit of what I think and believe, but also, I hope, be something that challenges us all to actually think and to ask questions. So firstly, I'd like to think of this question: are we genetically unique? And actually, what does it mean anyway? Touch on the selfish gene, something a little bit about DNA and genes. For Christians, actually, I guess the reason I'm asked to talk on this is that there might be some problem areas. Touch briefly on this question, made in the image of God. What does that actually mean? And then talk something about the creation purpose and salvation, which Christians talk quite a lot about. So here's some basic assumptions which you may or may not agree with. Firstly, genetics pervades everything. If you listen to the news, almost every news bulletin over the last couple of weeks has talked about genetics in some shape or form. Whether it's James Watson, the Nobel laureate, who was sent packing because he made comments that were thought to be racist, whether it's stem cell cloning, whether it's changes. Genetics is out there. It's something that pervades everything. It's the new science. It's said, and may indeed prove the answers to some diseases. It may help us begin to think of new ways to explore how we treat. It may be used to explain or even explain away behaviour. It even holds out this possibility of designer children, designer animals, agricultural advancement, modified food. All of this comes from an understanding of DNA and genetics. And I guess you take one small step from that point and say, therefore, DNA and genetics can explain who we are, because actually we are our DNA. It can explain where we came from. It can even go further than that and say it explains why we exist. So I guess the basic assumption out there is genetics is modern, it's hard science, it's testable, and it's provable. And those, I think, are fairly general assumptions throughout science and throughout society as a whole. That means if you're a Christian, you may actually have a problem, because it seems to be saying that if you take these basic assumptions that society accepts, then we're kind of reduced down to some sort of organic reaction. We're a walking, living, thinking, breathing test tube. We're programmed, we're predictable. And if that's the question, or if that's where we are, as a Christian, you may have a problem and say, well, in that case, where's free will? Where's God? What place is there in that reduction for anything more? And I guess there are two typical Christian responses. The first is Christians who go on the defensive and say, not me, I want nothing to do with this. And the danger is we can reject a lot of what does seem to be actually perfectly true and acceptable because we go on the defensive. And the second possibility is we become aggressive, and as Christians we may say, right, well, in that case there's a clear dichotomy. You either go with the science or you go with the faith position. And I guess what I'd like to get across tonight is I don't have a problem with the science and the faith. And yes, there are arguments and there are things I agree with and things I disagree with, but fundamentally I don't have a problem with an argument, and I don't have a problem with that tension existing, because I'm not sure that science should be pitched against faith. So there are objectives. One, for any of us, be us Christians or not, is be confident in actually joining the debate. Secondly, if you are a Christian, I'd like to try and dispel, if I can, some of the fears you may have. I want to start from a science perspective, but I also want to see in terms of a Christian, what are the positives in this in terms of dealing with this issue. What I'm not setting out to do tonight, I've just realised actually not only do I not have a watch, but there is a clock on the wall. I have no idea how long I'm supposed to talk for. How long am I supposed to talk for? Up to an hour, it'll be nothing like that. Fear not. Nothing like that. More like 2 or 3 hours. It really depends. I'll tell you when we're getting near halfway. Okay. What I'm not trying to do tonight, and it'd be good to have time for questions actually, what I'm not trying to do tonight is I'm not trying to give a comprehensive science view or a review, because that's far too much, and nor am I actually trying to present a complex set of ethical frameworks. So in some senses, I'm actually quite limited what I'm trying to achieve. In other senses, what I'm trying to do is say, actually, this is fun. I actually, despite everything, enjoy my job. A lot of that job involves genetics and involves DNA. The other thing I should have said in my spare time, I'm vice chair of the Gene Therapy Advisory Committee, which is the Department of Health Committee, sort of ethics and science that gives government advice on anything to do with gene therapy. So I know a little bit about this in my professional life, and believe me, it's fun, it's interesting, it's not without its challenges. But I'm not here to give you comprehensive ethics. Right, so what am I here for? Well, I guess for those of you who are Christians, who would regard yourself as believers, these words from Peter's letter, in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord. Okay, we know what that means. Be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that is within you. And in a sense, I'm making no apology from where I'm starting from. I'm starting from where I am as a person, not as a director of a cancer research centre or even a scientist or a medic or anything. I'm starting with who I am. It's what I believe. And I believe what I'm here to do tonight is to say, okay, I'm willing to talk about this. I'm willing to say, I can at least engage in a debate. I can give an answer for that hope that is within me. And I think that's so important that as Christians that we're not polarised, we're not afraid to tackle the issues, and at times we'll know the answer, and on other occasions, to be honest, we won't. And if I don't know, or if I'm not sure what I think, I'm not going to hide it from you tonight, and I'll invite you to challenge me, and if needs be, educate me on that. So, go back to our outline. Are we actually genetically unique? And I don't know, I won't ask you to put up your hands. I might do that later if you're beginning to drop off. There's a view out there that somehow if people aren't genetically unique, then somehow science is right. And perhaps Christians feel, therefore, that in some way we must be genetically unique. So at the beginning, I'm taking the point of view that DNA, our genetic code, is incredibly important. It does, to a very large extent, define who we are. Are we genetically unique? Well, I'm 98.5% similar, identical indeed, DNA-wise, to a chimpanzee. And some of you might say, well, that's not surprising. What's perhaps more surprising is that so are you. So in terms of genetic association, actually, we're all incredibly like chimpanzees. If you look at a number of molecules I have coded for by genes, you will find those same genes present in a small worm called a C. elegans, Cinorhabditis elegans, which is just a few millimeters long. Now, you may look at me and say, yeah, it doesn't surprise me, but the point is it's true for you too. So however you look at it, there is an incredible similarity across nature, from plants through animals to the higher mammals, if you will, to us, that says we are incredibly similar. So the question then really is, what are these genes? If you like, the code words, they're determining the precise nature of the proteins that make us, and those proteins are important because they have functions. So genes aren't the business, it's the proteins that the genes code for that have the functions. If you like, DNA is the alphabet. Are we genetically unique? And that's a big question. I've talked about humans and chimpanzees and how similar they are. Identical twins are different people. I don't think any of us would have any problem with that. And identical twins are almost, not quite, but almost identical. There are tiny, tiny little differences that can occur, but they're almost identical. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you're going to define us by DNA, and you want to take a Christian perspective that says, oh, I'm different, you've got a basic problem, unless somehow in that 1.5% variation, that defines our humanity. And I'm not sure scientifically I could persuade you of that case. So that means if we're looking, say, are we genetically distinct from all other species, the answer is Yes, we are distinct as we're different from one another, but actually that cannot be what defines us as human as opposed to animal. Now, you can take that two ways. One, you could say, so that's it. We are just our DNA. Let's all go home. Or, so what more is there to it that makes us different from the animals? In other words, right at the beginning of this, DNA cannot be the answer because it can deal with the science, but it cannot deal with the follow-through of that in terms of the sequelae about the nature of identity. And I think that's really important. So I can't come tonight and prove with science something that I don't think science can be used to prove, but that does not mean that, going back to the original question, are we more than our DNA, that my belief is anything other than the answer is yes, we are more than our DNA. And that's important. I cannot equate the science and the humanity and identity. They are two different aspects and have to be regarded. So that's one question. Are we genetically unique? The psalmist realized that and said, I know I'm different. And that's a declaration of faith, not the declaration of a molecular biologist. There is no book of molecular biology in the Bible, but there is declarations of faith. I praise you because I'm special. And that's not egotistical and it's not selfish. It's actually saying, I believe in a creator God who makes me special. It's not a scientific statement, it's a faith statement. The other thing that actually helps make us unique, and this isn't DNA, it's actually our emotions and that feeling of love. There are studies recently published in terms of trying to explain altruistic behaviour and explaining it in terms of natural selection and identity and evolution. That's absolutely fine, and there can be a logic to it to talk about conspicuous consumption as a way of attracting a mate. You know, I'm materialist because actually it shows how much money I've got. Or somebody who is benign and benevolent in giving things away to show I can afford this. That can have an evolutionary explanation. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but actually it doesn't take away from the fact that people can be different. That love, that emotions, that interaction is special. And of course that interaction isn't simply between a person and a person. From a faith perspective, that's between a person and their creator. So we have that, are we genetically unique? And in a sense, I'm not trying to give you answers tonight, I'm trying to ask questions. The science says we don't know. There are differences, but are they big enough? It's an open question. And it's worth saying at this point, the whole point of science, and it's not something that's widely believed, when I'm teaching students or when I'm talking research, science is there to put something up to knock it down. It is not there to prove anything. Science can't prove anything. Science can only design an experiment to disprove the last thing we believed. That is what science is for. So the idea of science being the same as scientism, believing that it proves, is actually a flawed approach to science. So are we genetically unique? Well, yes, we are, in one sense. Is that sufficient to explain our humanity and the existence of a creator God? I think that isn't actually something science is going to prove one way or t'other. So the second question then, or the second area, is what is the selfish gene? It's not, as some think, the shellfish gene for shyness. In other words, he always clams up. It's not the shellfish gene, it's the selfish gene. And of course, Richard Dawkins and other great thinkers, very smart people, will come and say, this explains everything. You can reduce it down to this. You can fit things to this model. And in very many cases, you absolutely can, but perhaps not in every single case. And the theory will go, genes do anything they have to in order to survive and propagate, be that by invading another organism, by proliferating at a vast rate. All behaviour is directed towards self-preservation. And then you have the layer on top of that, looking at things like altruism and explaining that in terms of fertility, protection of the species, etc. So you can look at the virus and think, what is the virus's role in life? Why on earth have viruses? You look at any of our genomes and you will find hundreds, thousands of viruses or bits of viruses, what appear to be bits of viruses, that are trapped in our genomes and have been for quite some time. They're not virus, but somehow they've got in there. So the selfish gene says, but they continue to perpetuate. As long as we exist, they exist. The virus that gives you common cold, it doesn't kill you, but it does a great job at producing a cloud of virus that affects other people so they can join the fun. So you have the selfish gene, yes, and the virus. What about the termite? Well, the termite's interesting, of course, because mother termite here, this queen termite surrounded by the workers, is there to be the egg factory. She is there to propagate her DNA. The workers, by and large, who are completely neutered, are there to ensure she does the business. So there you have an entire, in some ways apparently altruistic community designed around propagation of DNA. So does that mean it is all pure functional? What about the wolf? Well, of course, the wolf pack hunts together, looks after each other's young, protects each other. All of that might seem to support the idea of a selfish gene. And then we come to what is often a weak point for Christians, actually, which is the church. Is it a model of something different? And of course, we don't always give out the message that we would like to in terms of what we think the Christian message is about and how we should behave. So I think we actually have to challenge ourselves to say, why is it sometimes as Christians we're really quite aggressive in what we want to say and believe, but actually when you come to look at the behaviour, there does seem to be a fair degree of self-preservation and looking after ourselves and looking after our own. So we actually have to challenge ourselves as Christians and say, well, hang on a minute. Is this any more for me than simply preserving of what is close to me, albeit in a wider than a strict DNA sense? But I would argue that although self-preservation clearly is important, and we all have drives for that, and why not? Because that's what we're made to have. It's not the only determinant of behaviour. And there are other behaviours which can have another purpose. The words of Jesus, greater love has no one than this, than he lays down his life for his friends. And that's not said in a glib, silly way. That's not said as something simply at a time of remembrance of soldiers who have fallen in war. It's something much more fundamental about a state of being and the nature of what sacrifice is, that willingness to stop so that others who are different will go on. The third point then we come to, and this is, if you like, if I was advertising shampoo, this is the science part, but I'm only a humble cancer researcher, so it's pretty noddy science. What about DNA genes? So, DNA, the building bricks of life, you know all this stuff about double helixes and all this. Basically, it's just chemical goo. You stretch it out, it's very long. Every cell has that, the building bricks of life. So it's an almost incredible story how with 4 letters you can actually construct words with 3 letters in each. You can turn those words into sentences, which are the proteins. But crucially, and this is crucial, the grammar is important. So you can put together a sentence in a proper, logical, rational format of English, or you can speak like me. So you have grammar and you have accents. And DNA has both grammar and accents. So how you put the genes, the words, the sentences together affects meaning. What the accent is, which might be the amount of inflection on a particular word, changes. So you can have a protein that is actually very bog standard. You know, it's a building brick of your cell. It stops your cell going woof and collapsing in a heap. But you may have a variation of that gene that's a bit more Gallic and is a bit more able to be flexible. And that may convert a property in the cell or the tissue or the organism that changes behaviour. So the DNA itself is actually just like the telephone directory, to use another analogy. It isn't the telephone. It doesn't help the communication. You have to translate it. But we've got here the code of life. So could we make life artificially? And the answer is yes. People have actually made viruses from first principles. You can do that. Another thing that's important is, with DNA, it clearly gets damaged. So I don't know how big you are in numbers, but every day, every nucleus where the DNA is in your liver, if you want to just have a look, check it's still there, suffers 100 million hits from damaging oxygen species. That's a lot of hits in every single cell. Now, you don't get cancer from every hit. Your liver doesn't turn to goo and fall out. Actually, it gets repaired. So there's an incredible amount of effort in living cells to not just prevent damage happening, but once it happens to DNA, to actually make sure it repairs. And of course, it doesn't always get repaired. And here's my pathological roots. There's somebody's airway, that's normal lung, and this is a great big lung cancer. So the DNA doesn't always get repaired, and when DNA goes wrong, something may happen, and it may be a variety of things. It may be something as gross as cancer, or it may be simply the protein functions in a different way, or perhaps doesn't function at all. Perhaps there's virtually no effect in the individual. Perhaps there's a profound effect. But DNA encodes, and if it goes wrong and isn't repaired, there are consequences. So you can have a single gene mutation that causes cystic fibrosis, with lung disease, with gut disease, with disease of the pancreas, and in different individuals to different extents. It's DNA. It's not moral, it's not right or wrong, it's DNA, and yet sometimes the consequence of that DNA being different from somebody else is to result in a disease with profound effects for the individual. So DNA of itself is not moral. The fact that a DNA sequence is something doesn't mean whatever it codes for is right or wrong. It simply does what it does. We've touched on this. We don't all have identical DNA, pretty much, unless you're male or female, where you've got two X chromosomes. We've got pretty much the same genes. We've got 2 copies of everything. And effectively, these code for sentences. But the point I'm trying to make is the DNA varies and the sentences may be different, and that can affect meaning. So one sentence might read, David has tried hard this year, or David this year has been trying. And those mean very different things, even though effectively the building blocks are actually the same. On the one hand, that's me valiantly struggling on. On the other hand, that's me being a complete pain in the neck to other people around me. And yet the words are virtually identical. And it's the same in DNA. Tiny changes can make huge differences, or indeed no differences at all. The other thing is that, we've got buckets of genes, and we've got buckets of cells with buckets of genes, and we have buckets of genes switched on at any point. We also have buckets of genes, not necessarily in buckets, switched off. Genes are like switches, but it's not like a switch in your house where you go on and you press a button and the light goes on in this room. You press a button here. Actually, if you go to the New Royal Infirmary and try the lights, this is exactly how they work. You press a button in this room and a light goes on in a room down the corridor somewhere. If you press it again, another light goes on here and that one goes off. In other words, genes are complex. They do not function in isolation. There's a complex mesh, a complex network. So to say genes, a simple sequence of DNA is everything, is clearly nonsense, because it's much more complex than that. But to say that you have to invoke some other potential within that to make that a person is equally not justifiable from the science. It is not the DNA sequence nor the processing of it that makes me a human being, that makes my dog a dog, that makes my rabbit a rabbit. There's more to it than that. So it's complex. Some genetic characteristics are pretty simple, brown eyes, and some of those, as you know, will have quite profound effects. So you can have disorders of your hemoglobin in your red blood cells that may cause thalassemia or sickle cell disease that can be really quite profound and debilitating diseases. But other diseases like cancer, for example, are much more complex genetic changes with at least 100 different genes contributing by abnormal function or abnormal code to the disease actually occurring. And there will be sex differences. So some people will be colorblind and you can't see that the red one on the top there is different from the green one on the bottom because you're colorblind, and that will be men more than women. But it's important, having said all of that, that although DNA is complex, and it is, and although we can predict a lot, and we can, there are other factors. So there's this whole argument, debate, whatever, nature versus nurture. So there was a report recently from World Cancer Research Fund, I don't know if you saw it, was in the press, basically saying, why do people get cancer? So we know about smoking, and it came out and said obesity is bad for you, alcohol is bad for you, diet, etc., etc. So nurture is hugely important. Nurture interacts with your genes because basically we live in an environment where we're surrounded by all sorts of things, be it the food we eat, the air we breathe, the water we drink. All of these things have the potential to contain chemicals that can change how we are. So you can't think of DNA without thinking of nurture. The science does come to an end. So the point is, DNA and all the genes, the sentences it forms, affect all sorts of characteristics. Not just what we look like, but to some extent, how we behave, how we react, how we do things, how we approach things. And sometimes a single gene is enough. Sometimes it's a complex network of all sorts of genes, and that, of course, must be affected by the outside environment. So, having done the science, having, in a sense, said the DNA doesn't tell us apart, but that doesn't bother me, what we then come to is some of the problem areas. And we're not going to give comprehensive ethics, as I've said, but you may wish to think about, well, stem cells, the possibility of designer babies. That sounds a bit far-offish in science fiction, but if you look in many parts of the world where prenatal testing happens, you will find the normal ratio of boys to girls of 1.04 to 1 has changed to something like 1 to 0.6. So designer babies is happening. It simply happens that it's designing out female children being born. And then the whole area around cloning. And the challenge here, and this is very topical, because Ian Wilmot down the road has said, actually, I'm not so sure about all this stem cell stuff, we should go back to nuclear transfer. But there's an issue here which isn't just DNA, which isn't just science, that society has recognised. And it isn't always being based on simply religious belief or other. There is an awareness in society that actually this is something different, something special. That doesn't justify that we're more than our DNA from a scientific point of view, but there is something about us that says we are travelling on a dangerous road and we have to be careful. Saturday, BBC News Online, Ian Wilmot, on the basis of the Japanese paper, which I think was published in Science Today, a new way of developing cells that can be used for, if you like, spare part replacement. And he said on the basis of that working better than trying to make human embryonic cells, he says, I'm going to stop. And that's quite interesting, and I think that's quite formative, because there you had a huge ethical debate, and there still is, and there still will be, because as I was coming across, Ian Wilmot was saying on Radio 4, well, it doesn't mean they shouldn't do it, it's just I'm not going to do it because I don't think it's going to work. But it's actually interesting that there's a case for science saying, forget the ethics. The science says actually you're not backing a winner doing the stem cell stuff. There's probably a better way. So science and ethics are not always diametrically opposed. And science often supports ethics. And bad science is unethical. And good science is ethical. And I think that's important too. It's not that science needs to be controlled. Science needs to be used. And it can both support and refute particular ethical positions. I'm skipping past some of the others: genetics, screening and abortion, eugenics. We have to touch on creation and evolution. And then think about behaviour. So I guess when you think of creation, and this isn't about creation because I'm trying to do a bigger picture, I hope, in terms of what I was asked to cover, which was, are we more than our DNA? I guess where you've got to start from is saying, what's actually at stake here? Because you speak to some people and it is absolutely rock solid, the foundation of the Christian belief, that if creation doesn't happen, or somebody could disprove it with science, which is already said can't be done, science cannot disprove it, but supposing it could, that somehow that questions God's power or God's very existence. And that, of course, can be very threatening. Or it may be that it seems to be a challenge between a dogma of faith or religion against the fact that as we make progress, we're wiser, we're smarter, we're cleverer, we have a scientific dogma. And again, I would argue, actually, it's pointless. And I guess underpinning it, and quite rightly so, is the fear that if this debate goes one way or the other, we fundamentally change our view of humanity and what it is to be human. And that is a major area on which we should actually set up the tents to wage battle. But it's not them against us. It's not creation against evolution. I would argue it's actually reason against unreason. So what's at stake? yes, I think there probably is the subtext. It's a challenge of God's authority or his existence. I think if you're a Christian, though, we've got to choose our battles carefully. We can't use science to disprove science when I've already said that science can't prove anything. So we can get into a circular argument where we're actually equally specious. It doesn't mean, don't get me wrong, that we don't engage in scientific debate. But at the end of the day, that's what science is about. It's about arguing, it's about debating, it's about knocking the latest idea off the perch and replacing it with something else that can be tested. But science will not disprove science any more than science could ever disprove God, which it cannot do. I think it's a contest of unequals. The DNA science is pretty clear. What we're talking about tonight is not the science, and much of that may prove to be wrong. For example, didn't plan to say this, there was a paper, I don't know, a few months ago, longer, 6 months ago in Nature. We assume hereditary is DNA, yeah? There was a paper in Nature, nice paper, suggesting that there's at least an element of hereditary, which is RNA, which we usually think is the message protein. Now that completely throws out any idea that DNA is everything. Doesn't have any comment on whether or not God created, but actually what it does say is even when we think we're in incredibly secure scientific grounds, we're actually still wrong. We're still learning, still discovering. So I think we're talking about a contest of unequals here. I think on the one hand, we may be at one extreme talking about militant atheism, on the other hand, we're talking about faith. And the other thing I would say, having spoken to a number of people, both scientifically and out with, for many scientists, actually creation evolution isn't for them a make or break decision. That's not to say it's not important, don't get me wrong. I'm trying to kind of thread here a difficult line, but it is not a make or break because many people will say science, I accept, cannot prove or disprove something. It can only suggest, and therefore it cannot by definition come into an area where faith is involved and say, well, it's simply wrong. It cannot be done. It is not a make or break. The other thing that's at stake is what is there to prove? And I think you have to ask that question over those who would use science in a militant atheistic way, if you will, to say that disproves God. It simply is bad science to do that. It's pointless. What is there to prove doing that? And I think for Christians, it's as well, not just to look back. The whole point of having a creation account in the Bible is to tell us that God created us for a purpose. So we actually have the bonus, if you will, from a Christian perspective, saying, I'm not just looking back, I'm looking forward. This isn't all about the past. It's about the significance of what happened in the past for what is going to happen in the future. That's hugely important. I was sitting at Heathrow last week and picked up the New Statesman. I can't even remember the guy's name. He was talking about what he'd read. He'd been over to the States because he's written some book. And he said, I'd rather absorb myself in David Copperfield for some true love fiction. Blah, blah, blah. I prefer this enormously to the angry panegyrics of militant atheists such as Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. Brilliant people, but lacking in wisdom and compassion. And I guess thinking about what this talk was, I thought, wisdom and compassion, are we more than our DNA? It kind of comes out that the science isn't the answer. There's more to it. There's wisdom, there's compassion. This is from Department of Health for schools, which shows that microsporidia and eye are actually fairly closely related, which is really upsetting because I've never sent them a Christmas card. But the point is, if you take this view, we're making links between things and then making links that say one comes from the other. This is from the Mercedes website. And it kind of stands the point. They're all silver, they've all got 4 wheels, they all look kind of vaguely similar. Similarity doesn't actually mean chance, it could also mean that there was the same design team involved. So the point is, if DNA is the template, fine, I accept that. The best evidence says that's the case. But that actually does not, and indeed cannot say, but that then gives something about motive or purpose or creation or design. They're simply not comparable streams of data. I think that's quite interesting to think of that. Yes, similarity, but does similarity necessarily mean one goes to the other? Why should it? Why should there be a problem with accepting a God could actually do that? I said it was important not just to look back, but to look forward. And these words, people get bogged down sometimes. If you go down to this bit here, God foreknew, he also predestined, diddly-diddly-dumph. Okay, but look at the very last. And those he predestined, he called. Those he called, he justified. He made them as if for their creation purpose. And then he also takes to be with himself. The whole point of the Bible and the whole point and the importance of God having created us is we were created for a purpose. So what I'm saying is, yes, it's very interesting for me to consider how science and faith can fit together around creation. But I find it interesting, not a make or break. What I do know is that I was created for a purpose. I messed that up, and God has provided a way for that purpose to be retrieved. Now that to me seems a very useful approach to what we're about. He's called us. He wants us to change. He wants us to be improved. And ultimately, he wants us to enjoy that original purpose. Now, that is actually what the Christian message is about. It's not just the past. It's the past because the past has an implication for the present. And the present is important because of the future. So I'm not sure that this is helping you answer questions, but I do hope it's helping you ask questions. So we're almost halfway through now. So, genetic explanation of behaviour. Does it matter if DNA affects how we behave? And indeed, does DNA affect how we behave? Again, you can see I had a busy weekend. This is from The Economist on Saturday. And it was breastfeeding may or may not make children more intelligent. So that's a kind of punchy headline, isn't it? May or may not, or might, depends on the... Okay, the point is, it depends on your genes. And the article goes on. What I thought was interesting, caught my eye, was this sentence. Making stupid comments about the second question, that is, to what extent does race make a difference? Because of race, of course, is determined in large part by your DNA constitution. Making stupid comments about race can be a career-killing move, as James Watson, a co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, recently found, and I guess you're aware of this. But the point is, however you look at DNA, whether you come from a faith position or not, you cannot get away from the idea that people don't think. You can simply regard other people simply as DNA, right? Because you then have overlaid on that the fact, well, what if there is racial difference? Well, we don't want to talk about that, and in many ways quite right, because the way it's talked about is often, one, scientifically inaccurate first and foremost, and two, it's often being used for another agenda. But the point is, forget faith. Even in society, we know that simply to reduce people to DNA is to demean them and to allow the worst excesses of the past, which have conventionally been blamed in religion, to actually be applied again. Hitler was a master of it with the whole theory of eugenics. So we know that if we actually take the view that we are nothing more than our DNA, the behaviour that results in is people not so far away from Richard Dawkins saying there are too many people in the world, so we should let some just wipe themselves out. Evolutionary, there are too many people. Society knows that is wrong, has a feeling morally that is wrong. It says, no, we're more than that. There's something different about us. So even before you have to invoke some supernatural God, we know that it is not even pragmatically sensible to regard people simply as DNA, because there is no reason then to have the behaviour and the norms that we accept, and the reason why people like Watson are scorned or criticised by society. So before you have a God, it's still true that society says we are more than our DNA, because of the effect of believing that that's all we are, because of the effect that we have on our behaviour. So we know there are things that are genetic. Cats aren't terribly keen on swimming. I must add that this isn't my cat. I took this off a BBC website, so, purely illustrative, and I'm sure no animal was harmed in the making of this film, as they say. But we know that, and yet a tiger can swim, and it's a cat, but lions don't like water. So there's something there that is genetic, that's different. So behaviour can be genetic. Rottweilers have a reputation. I'm not quite sure why there's a Union Jack here behind it, but yeah, I'm not sure actually. Maybe it's going to play football for England. But Rottweilers have a reputation, and in part they have been bred to have that. So you've got a Doberman crossed with a Rhodesian Ridgeback, and you've got the best of both worlds, or the worst of both worlds. You've got the aggression and the stupidity of those two animals put together. Athletic prowess. If you're not taking your illicit steroids or your erythropoietin, there's clearly a genetic effect. It's much to my wife's disappointment that I've never actually appeared at the Olympics. And she says I probably never will. And I blame genetics. And nobody believes me. Alcoholism. There are very strong genetic influences. You can get strains of rats that are actually born alcoholics. But if you don't give them a drink at absolutely the critical moment, they won't be an alcoholic. You give them a drink when they're just a couple of weeks old, they're alcoholics for life. They just go around looking for it. Now that's important. It means genetics is important. Doesn't mean it's right, but it means genetics is important. Heart disease. 60% of heart disease has probably got a genetic underlying basis. Okay, smoking doesn't help. High cholesterol doesn't help, but actually genetics. Depression, huge, particularly in young people. Huge genetic component to depression. But it's a disease and we treat it. We don't accept it simply because it's DNA coded, that somehow that's acceptable. Homosexuality, strong evidence that there is a genetic association. But that is neither right nor wrong, moral nor immoral. It's simply a fact. There's that predisposition. And violence. Yes, there's a whole literature on the biology of violence. A lot of that, of course, is nurture. It's the environment. It's how a child has been brought up. But there's a strong genetic influence. So the point is, a lot of behaviour is genetically determined or genetically predisposed to. But critically, being genetically influenced, having the DNA matters, doesn't mean it's right. Science is not moral. Not only can I not prove things to be true, it is not moral. Something existing doesn't mean it's right, but nor does it mean it's wrong. So again, it's limiting science. Not to say science is irrelevant, because clearly it's not, but it does not have a moral position. It simply states what there is. On the other hand, from a Christian perspective, there is a view that says, actually, however we're predisposed, we have choices, but ultimately we flunk those choices and we've rebelled. We've gone against that perfect creation purpose for which we were made. It's not a scientific statement, it's a faith statement, but it sits perfectly consistently with the science. Science has no moral position, yes or no, and we've already gone beyond it, as I've said, in terms of how we react with one another and judge one another. So the conclusions from this part then, yes, many behavioural traits can be partly explained by our DNA makeup. I have a terrible temper. When I was young, I had a terrible temper that people saw. Now that I'm not so young, people don't see it so much unless they know me and they know the telltale signs. But we have genetically determined behaviour. But it doesn't mean I'm right if I fly off the handle at every trivial thing. That's wrong. I have to learn to control that genetically driven behaviour. And for me, it might be my temper. For somebody else, it might be the fact that you're a lazy so-and-so. For others, it might be that you're a greedy guts. For others, it might be that you have a problem with alcohol. It may be genetically determined, but it doesn't mean that we accept it. Our whole point in society is to strive to be something that we are not, simply because of the genes that we have or the environment in which we were born. And that's the whole purpose of a lot of government plans to try and get youngsters who are disadvantaged to move them on, because we believe it is good to do. And that, to some extent, is trying to retrieve that creation purpose, to make us something that we are not, but to make us something that actually we were created to be. So I think you have to take on board, we have this spiritual inheritance, we have this spiritual purpose. That is the creation purpose. That is why we are more than our DNA. And yes, we've all come to this point of rebellion, but there is that point to try and make it back. You've got to ask the question, are we made in the image of God? If you think of a world, when I was a student, and I still do actually, I loved Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre and people like that, because it's just so depressing. And I tell you, if you're a medical student, there's nothing better than being depressed by good literature rather than being depressed reading textbooks. But if you think of a world without God, actually, you don't get the Richard Dawkins world. You get the world of Camus or Sartre. It's hopeless. It's existential. I do what I do because I can do it. It's hopeless. That is the world without God, because it's driven by self-interest. So if you have a world without God, if we are nothing more than our DNA, we are different. And if we weren't different, however you want to explain it, I'm not saying it proves God, but my suggestion is that a faith in God who created actually takes us beyond that hopelessness and says, actually, there is a better way, there is a creation purpose. We're made in the image of God. Scripture tells us that. He says, not only did I make you in my image, you're different, you're special. I did it for a purpose, and I want you to be distinct, and I want you to be different. You cannot simply regard creation as what happened X years ago. Creation is what we're about today, and it's about what we are to become. We are to be recreated. So, irrespective of our individual DNA, the genetic traits we may have, I believe that we have a purpose that is a creation purpose, and we have a route to follow to make that. And our differences, therefore, do not exclude us from our moral responsibility towards our Maker. It's all right, that's my wife. I'm on call. She's got my phone. So question time could be short. So finally, creation, purpose, and salvation. We've kind of said this. The point is, yes, we're our DNA, but we're more than our DNA. God takes us as we are, and he changes us. And the whole point of us, one, this means something very special. It means that nobody is actually a write-off. Nobody is a genetic freak that isn't worth the time. Each of us has a purpose. Each of us has a value. And each of us, therefore, in some sense, reflects that image of a creator God. Together, we're part of a whole. We're very individualistic in our society. We're very personal. And yet, if you go to other parts of the world, there is still that sense of, I am me. I am an individual, but I'm actually part of a community. And that community is hugely important. Even within Islam, the community of Islam, the Ummah, is so important because I'm not just me. There's something greater. There's a greater consciousness and a greater awareness than simply me, myself. And that's what we should be reflecting as people. We have a model of Jesus, who was, if you like, that recapitulation of a perfect creation, the master craftsman. We have a number of examples in the Bible of people who came with their own psychological, genetically predetermined hang-ups. People like Peter, who was just a complete waster, complete impetuous man of action, who always got it wrong, and yet who changed. And those weaknesses became strengths. Jeremiah, completely depressive if you read it, and yet there was much more to him than that. We have these people who were as they were, determined by their DNA, who were different because of the purpose to which their lives were given. So I'm suggesting to you, we're more than just our bodies. However you want to define it, and I have my way, but however you want it, we're more than bodies. We're body, we're spirit, we're made in God's image. He can change us to make us more like that original creation purpose. Our strengths and weaknesses are actually there and can be used. It's not that we should all be conformed to be exactly the same. What we're told to be conformed to is to be different, to have a pattern, a creation purpose. Crucially in this, and it seems weird if we're talking about DNA, Jesus died for each person. What on earth does that mean? It's got nothing to do with DNA, but it's got everything to do with uniqueness, and it's got everything to do with specificity. Each one of us as an individual, as part of something bigger, but each one of us with our own special. And then finally, it's Jesus, it's Christ who justifies, who helps us regain that original perspective of being not just a coded machine, but something with more than that, something with spiritual and emotional content. We're more than our DNA content. So the question, are we more than our DNA? I would say yes, we are. But that's not to take away from any way the science. And that's what I spent my day doing, day in, day out. Genetic inheritance is hugely important. You can't dismiss it. You can't say it doesn't matter. You can't say all behaviour is just morally bad and it's not genetically predetermined. A lot of it is genetically determined. But that doesn't mean morally it's acceptable. It simply means it's genetically predetermined. We have to then deal with it. I think if you're going to believe in God at all, it's not a huge problem to believe that God is a God who surpasses nature. If Jesus can be raised from the dead, and as a Christian you have to believe that, or you've got no starting block. If Jesus can be raised from the dead, then God can do anything, and why should we be anything less than what he wants us to be? I would argue against a retrospective faith that's fixated on the past and doesn't see that the whole point of the past and knowing it is so that we know the future, and in the light of that, live our lives in the present. And then I think actually we should celebrate because of who we are and what we are and the Creator God that made us. Thank you very much.